January 1st, 1651, Scone, Scotland. Let's set the scene. It is freezing cold, not just Scottish winter cold, but the kind of metaphorical cold that freezes your soul. Sitting on a makeshift throne in a drafty church is Charles Stuart. He's 20 years old, he's tall, dark, cynical, and he is currently the most unemployed man on the planet. He is supposed to be crowned King Charles II today. But the room isn't filled with cheering loyalists, it's filled with the Covenanters, grim-faced Scottish Presbyterian ministers who look like they haven't smiled since 1560. Before they put the crown on his head, they hand him a piece of paper, the Solemn League and Covenant. Basically, it's a contract that says, sign here to admit your father was an evil tyrant, your mother is an idol-worshipping heretic, and you promise to turn Britain into a religious police state run by us. Yeah, in our history books, Charles II, the ultimate pragmatist, swallowed his vomit, signed the paper, and took the crown. He sold his soul for an army. But today, let's see what happens when the kid snaps. Charles looks at the paper. He looks at the ministers. He remembers his father's head rolling off the block in London 2 years ago. And he stands up. He doesn't sign it. He rips it in half. He throws the confetti in their faces and says, you know what? Keep the crown. I'm out. The coronation is cancelled. Charles walks out into the snow. And just like that, with one burst of teenage rebellion, the history of the British Isles just drove off a cliff. To really understand why this moment is a total catastrophic train wreck, we need to rewind a bit. You need to understand the absolute mess that was Britain in 1651. 2 years earlier, England decided that kings were officially out of style. They dragged Charles I out of his palace and took his head off in front of a cheering crowd. The country is no longer a kingdom, it's a republic. And it's run by Oliver Cromwell, the scariest man to ever hold a Bible. Imagine a dictator who hates Christmas theater and smiling. That's your guy. This leaves his son, young Charles II, in a very weird spot. He holds the title, but he doesn't hold the keys. He is a king without a kingdom, a couch-surfing royal with $0 in his bank account, running for his life across Europe. Desperate times call for desperate allies. Enter the Scots, specifically the Covenanters. Now, these guys hated Charles's dad. But guess what? They hate Cromwell even more. They need a figurehead to rally around to reclaim their independence. Charles needs an army to take back his throne. It was the ultimate toxic marriage of convenience. Think of it as the worst Tinder date in history that neither side can escape. The Scots despised everything about Charles. They hated his Anglican faith, they hated his French Catholic mother, and they really hated his love for partying and women. Charles, he looked at them and saw a bunch of hypocrites who loved the sound of their own voices. He despised their endless 6-hour sermons and their miserable lifestyle, but they were stuck with each other. The deal was simple. You sign our crazy religious contract and we give you an army to march on London. It was a transaction, a deal with the devil. So by refusing to sign at Scone, Charles didn't just cancel a party. He didn't just annoy his hosts. He pulled the pin on the only grenade he had left, and he was holding it right next to his face. Do you think he had a backup plan? Let's see. So Charles walks away, he leaves the contract unsigned on the table and storms out. And what happens the next morning? Total, absolute chaos. Scotland instantly implodes. Without the king serving as that one unifying symbol to hold the tribes together, the Covenanters do exactly what they do best. They start fighting each other. Instead of preparing for the massive English army marching toward them, they split into factions. You have the hardliners screaming that Charles was the devil incarnate and the moderates screaming that they just blew their only chance at survival. They spend the critical spring of 1651 purging their own ranks. They aren't checking if their soldiers can shoot. They are checking if their soldiers are religiously pure enough. It is a circular firing squad. Meanwhile, down south, Oliver Cromwell is watching this dumpster fire with a massive smile on his face. In our actual timeline, Cromwell had to fight tooth and nail to conquer Scotland. It was brutal work, but in this timeline, he doesn't even need to break a sweat. He marches his professional, battle-hardened new model army north. Do you think the Scots put up a fight? Please? They are too busy arguing over theology to load their muskets. Cromwell rolls into Edinburgh like he's on a sightseeing tour. He crushes Scottish independence not in months but in weeks. Scotland is annexed into the English Commonwealth under brutal military rule. And Charles II, forget the history books. He doesn't get his heroic escape story. There is no hiding in an oak tree. There is no romance. He flees back to France immediately, not as a fighting king, but as a pathetic failure who was too proud to do the dirty work. His reputation is absolute trash. But if you think that sounds bad, wait until we look at the details. Because the level of stupidity here is actually impressive. Let's zoom in on the Scots for a second. Because honestly, in the annals of military incompetence, you have to admire their absolute unwavering commitment to self-destruction. And in military strategy, there is a golden rule that has stood the test of time. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. when a massive army is marching to burn your house down, you grab a rifle and you stand next to anyone else willing to shoot back. But the Scottish Covenanters, they missed that memo. In fact, they shredded the memo and set it on fire. When Charles walks away from the negotiating table, the fragile alliance shatters into a million pieces. The Kirk, the fanatical governing body of the church, decides that the reason God might be angry with them isn't because of the English army at the gates. No, that would be too logical. They decide God is angry because their own army has too many sinners in it. So instead of drilling formations, digging trenches, or stockpiling gunpowder, they initiate something called the Act of Classes. This is real history, folks. I am not making this up. They literally start purging their best officers and most experienced soldiers. Why? Because those men had fought for Charles's father in the past, or because they weren't radical enough in their prayers, or maybe they just enjoyed a glass of whiskey on a Sunday. Imagine this scenario. You have the new model army, the most terrifying professional war machine in Europe, thundering toward your border. You can hear their drums, you can smell their matches burning. And what do? You decide to fire your best general because he didn't attend Bible study last Wednesday. You take your battle-hardened veterans, guys who know how to hold a pike line, guys who have killed men before, and you kick them out of the camp. You replace them with pious teenagers who know all the Psalms but don't know which end of the musket goes boom. It is a moral panic in the middle of a war zone. The hardline faction known as the Remonstrants actually starts refusing to fight alongside the moderate Resolutioners. They are genuinely more afraid of spiritual contamination from their own countrymen than they are of English bullets. They are effectively digging their own graves and arguing about which shovel is holier while they do it. Now, let's flip the camera and look at this from Oliver Cromwell's perspective. Oliver Cromwell is not a man who jokes. He is a military genius. He is cold, calculating, and ruthlessly efficient. He leads the new model army. Forget the image of peasants with pitchforks. These are professional killers in matching red coats. They are disciplined, they are well-fed, and they are religious zealots who believe they are the hammer of God. They are effectively the Navy SEALs of the 17th century. In the real timeline, the one you know, conquering Scotland, was a nightmare for Cromwell. The Scots were united behind Charles mostly. They had a massive defensive line. They trapped Cromwell. They starved him. They engaged in guerrilla warfare. At the Battle of Dunbar, they almost wiped him out until they made a tactical error. It was a close call that haunted Cromwell for years, but here in this no-deal timeline, Cromwell crosses the border expecting a bloodbath. He expects sniper fire from the hills. He expects a wall of Scottish pikes, and he finds nothing. No resistance, no unified front, just a bunch of angry Scots shouting at each other in muddy fields. He must have thought it was a trap. He probably paused his horse on a ridge, looked through his spyglass, and thought, surely it can't be this easy. Where is the ambush? But let's see. He pushes forward. He takes a fortress. No resistance. He takes a town. The gates are open. The Scottish resistance crumbles like wet cake because half the Scottish army is busy arresting the other half for heresy. When Cromwell arrives in Edinburgh, it isn't a siege, it's a police action. He walks in. He occupies the country with ruthless, terrifying efficiency. He shuts down the Scottish Parliament. He strips them of their laws. He imposes strict martial law. He builds massive citadels to watch over the population. Scotland doesn't just lose a war, they lose their identity. For the next decade, Scotland isn't a kingdom. It is an occupied province, a massive boot camp for Cromwell's soldiers. The dream of Scottish independence, the very thing the Covenanters were trying to protect, dies right there in the mud. And it wasn't killed by English steel, it was killed by Scottish stubbornness. And finally, let's talk about the man who started this whole mess, the man who walked away. Charles Stuart. In the history, we know Charles signed the deal, invaded England, lost the Battle of Worcester, and then spent 6 weeks on the run. That escape the famous Royal Oak story where he hid in a tree while Cromwell's soldiers walked beneath him created a legend. It made him a romantic hero. It made the English people love him. They saw a young king willing to risk his life for his crown. It gave him street cred. It proved that he had skin in the game. But in this timeline, Charles refuses the deal, packs his bags, and hops on the first boat back to Paris. He saves his dignity, sure. He doesn't have to listen to any boring sermons. He doesn't have to eat oatmeal, but he loses something much more valuable than his pride respect. Europe watches this happen. The kings of France and Spain, powerful monarchs who believe in the divine right of kings, look at Charles and shake their heads. They don't see a tragic hero. They see a coward. They see a spoiled brat who wanted the crown but wasn't willing to pay the price for it. He becomes a laughingstock in the courts of Europe. He is the pretender who gave up without a fight. The king of nothing. His bank account runs dry. His allies abandon him one by one. Who wants to invest money or soldiers in a king who quits when things get tough? Who wants to back a horse that refuses to run? Do you think so? Do you think he is better off because he survived? Sure, physically he's alive. He's drinking expensive wine in Paris. He's sleeping in a warm bed with a mistress while the Scots are being slaughtered by Cromwell. But politically, he is dead. By refusing to get his hands dirty, Charles II ensures that he will never ever sit on the throne of England. The Restoration, that glorious moment in 1660 when England grew tired of the Republic and welcomed the king back with open arms, is cancelled. Why would England invite him back? He didn't suffer with them. He didn't fight for them. He ran away when it mattered most. To the English people, he is just a stranger with a fancy last name. So the Republic stands. Cromwell's statue stands tall in Westminster, and Charles becomes a footnote, the last pathetic whimper of the Stuart dynasty dying alone in exile. And if you think that's bad for Charles, just wait until you see what happens to the rest of the world. Because without a king to balance the scales, without the return of the monarchy to soften the edges, things in England are about to get very, very dark. The lights are going out and they might never come back on. Now, for the twist. The long game. You all know what happened in real history, right? It's the happy ending. Oliver Cromwell dies in 1658. His son is too weak to rule. The system collapses, and in 1660, England begs Charles II to come back. It's called the Restoration. Everyone parties, the theaters reopen, and the king is back on the throne. Delete that. Throw that timeline in the trash. In this timeline, Charles II never went through the hardships that made him smart. In exile, he is bitter, he is entitled, and most importantly, he is broke. Desperate for cash, he looks for a sugar daddy. France and Spain are happy to help, if he converts. So Charles II openly converts to Catholicism to secure his pension. Big mistake. To the English people, this makes him permanently radioactive. They might hate Cromwell's strict rules, but they hate the Pope more. There is absolutely no way they are inviting a French-funded Catholic puppet back to the throne. Meanwhile, back in London, Oliver Cromwell is thriving. Because he didn't have to spend years fighting bloody royalist uprisings in Scotland, he secures his borders early. He focuses inward. His military dictatorship becomes incredibly stable. It stops being a chaotic emergency government and starts being a well-oiled machine. It becomes efficient. And when Cromwell finally dies, the system is strong enough to survive without him. The generals don't panic. They don't call the king. They simply look around the table, shrug, and appoint the next Lord Protector. Do you see the twist yet? The British monarchy didn't die on the chopping block with Charles I. It died in that freezing cold church in Scone. By refusing to sign the deal, Charles II ensured that the Republic of England wasn't just a 10-year phase. It became the new normal. England becomes a permanent military junta, a somber Puritan version of ancient Rome. So the king is gone forever. But what happens to an England run by religious soldiers for 100 years? Let's see. Here is part 5 of the script, written in a gripping, atmospheric, US native style with a heavy dose of dark humor. So what does a permanent, uncontested Puritan Republic actually look like? Welcome to the no fun zone. And I'm not just saying that to be mean. I mean it literally. In the history books, Charles II is nicknamed the Merry Monarch. Why? Because after 11 years of miserable Puritan rule, he came back and threw a national keg party. He reopened the theaters. He brought back comedy, bright clothes, dancing around the maypole, and most importantly, Christmas. But in this timeline, cancel Christmas. Forever. There is no restoration. There is no Merry Monarch. London doesn't become the swinging center of culture. It becomes a joyless grey barracks on a rainy island. Imagine a North Korea run by religious zealots in the 17th century. That is England now. Theaters, they remain boarded up. Acting is considered lying, and lying is a sin. Music, only if it's a psalm. Dancing straight to jail. The color palette of the entire country is sad beige. Well, but the damage goes deeper than just boredom. Let's talk about science. In our world, Charles II founded the Royal Society. This was the club that gave us Isaac Newton, gravity, and the scientific method. It flourished because the king thought science was cool and protected the nerds from the religious fanatics. But here, there is no royal patron. Innovation is viewed with suspicion. Science looks a lot like witchcraft to a military dictatorship. So, the scientific revolution. It gets strangled in the crib. Isaac Newton probably dies as an obscure math teacher terrified to publish his work because the Lord Protector might think gravity is a challenge to God's will. Now let's look across the ocean. Do you think America escapes this nightmare? Let's see. In our timeline, the American colonies were a mix of weirdos, but in this timeline, Cromwell turns his gaze west. Colonies like Virginia, which were loyal to the king, are treated like rebellious teenagers. Cromwell's regime cracks down hard. He sends his iron generals to govern the colonies. The result: the American identity forms much, much faster, but it's not formed around taxation without representation. It is formed around pure, unadulterated hatred for the military dictatorship back home. The founding fathers of this timeline aren't gentlemen philosophers. They are desperate rebels fighting a guerrilla war against a fundamentalist regime. The American Revolution happened 50 years early, and it is a lot bloodier. And finally, what about our boy Charles? The man who could have saved everyone if he just signed a piece of paper. He doesn't die a hero. He doesn't die in a palace surrounded by spaniels and mistresses. He dies an old, bitter, forgotten man in a rented room in Paris. His liver is shot from cheap wine. His friends have all left him. He is the last pretender to a throne that no longer exists. When he takes his last breath, nobody in England cries. In fact, most people have forgotten his name. He wanted to be a king on his own terms. Well, he got his wish. He remained a king in his own mind while his country turned into a prison. So the next time you complain about a boring family Christmas dinner, just remember it could be worse. You could be living in the Republic of Cromwell. Here's the final part of the script. I focused on making the moral dilemma feel personal and urgent using punchy US idioms to drive the point home. So let's bring this all back to you. We love to romanticize pride, don't we? We admire the guy who sticks to his guns. We love the rebel who looks at the contract and says, "No, I will not compromise." Charles II at Scone chose his pride over his crown. In the moment, it feels heroic, doesn't it? Like a scene from a movie. But look at the scoreboard. He lost everything. He died a nobody, and his country fell into a century of joyless gray darkness. In real history, Charles swallowed his pride. He let the Scots humiliate him. He signed their stupid fanatical paper. He lied through his teeth. He was a total hypocrite. And guess what? Because he was willing to eat dirt in 1651, he survived long enough to win the game. He reclaimed the throne, he brought back the good times, and he died a king. So I have to ask you, when life backs you into a corner, puts a gun to your head, and hands you a raw deal, what do you do? Do you choose the noble, catastrophic failure? Do you go down with the ship just to prove a point? Or do you choose the humiliating, pragmatic survival? Do you smile, sign the paper, and live to fight another day? Let's see what you're really made of. Would you sign the devil's contract to get what you want, or would you let the kingdom burn just to keep your hands clean? Let me know in the comments below. Are you team pride or team pragmatism? I'll be reading the replies to see who the survivors are. Thanks for watching the history that almost was. See you in the next timeline. Charles chose pride and lost everything. In reality, he swallowed his ego, signed the paper, and died a king. It teaches us a brutal lesson. Sometimes honor is just a luxury for losers. So look in the mirror. Would you sign the devil's contract to get what you want? Or would you walk away with nothing but your dignity? Let's see who you really are. Drop a comment below. Team pride or team power? Thanks for watching.